Okay, great. Thank you, Thomas, and team. I think I really appreciate the opportunity to share some perspectives from Zambia and from Africa. But maybe just a quick background of the work that we're doing here in Zambia. Basically, I am part of a project basically called the Tax and Education Alliance, or the ActionAid Alliance, which Tax Justice Network, who were speaking earlier, are part of, but alongside a few other actors in the space of tax justice and education. And basically, the project is just linking education financing to the tax justice advocacy to see how we can scale up education financing in developing countries. So for the case of Zambia, I have been coordinating the work that we are doing here. And part of that work has been a big part of the advocacy has been the UN Tax Convention and the conversations around why we need that. So I think maybe you can go to the next slide. So I'll basically just, as Thomas mentioned, I'll just be looking at three key points in the time provided, giving you some African, but mostly Zambian perspectives of the effects of the current system and why it may need to change, and then also why Africa has taken the lead and what we want to see basically going forward. So the next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of the Zambian or African perspective, I think, as we all know, I think the issue of illicit financial flows, particularly in the extractives sector, and I'm speaking to the case of Zambia, is very, it's a huge problem. And there have been multiple studies trying to estimate how much exactly we're losing, varied depending on the way these things are measured. You find that the private sector are not that forthcoming, particularly in developing countries such as Zambia. So a lot of these statistics are largely based on data that's available. But I think a recent study in about 2023 estimated that Zambia loses about $3 billion US dollars to tax avoidance every year. And then when you're looking at the Africa scale, this is much higher, obviously, and estimated by UNCTAD to be about 89 billion US dollars annually lost through illicit financial flows, tax avoidance, and tax evasion. And this is usually done by large multinationals. In the case of Zambia, again, a lot of these multinationals are based in the extractive sector. But we do have cases where other sectors also contribute or exhibit the same practices when it comes to tax avoidance. And I think a lot of these are channeled through mechanisms such as our double taxation agreements, which we have one with Ireland as well, and the incentives that we offer towards foreign direct investment. And usually these incentives are advised or proposed by large international financial institutions. So that includes the OECD and their frameworks, but also the World Bank and the IMF in the case of many African countries. So in the case of Zambia, we are currently signed on to our 13th IMF program since we got independence, and which has just wrapped up this year. It's been extended to December, and we are already looking like we're going onto our 14th IMF program. And a lot of the advice given under these programs is in line with austerity. So that's looking at budget cuts, but at the same time also scaling up taxation, but usually in a manner that's very unfair, prioritizing taxes such as VAT, which is regressive in our opinion as civil society, given that it's non-discretionary in terms of, or discriminatory in terms of who pays it and how much they pay. So as you can see in the small table below, our VAT or value-added tax in Zambia was only contributing about 14% of our total tax collection as a nation in 2021. That was before the IMF program. But since then, you can see that it's almost doubled. And this is based on the advice given by the IMF. In addition to that, I think there's also advice around cutting subsidies, especially at times that we most need them. Currently, Zambia is going through a period of a high cost of living, while at the same time, citizens are being taxed quite heavily based on the advice, again, that we're getting. Another thing I'll just quickly add is the issue around debt, which is, in my opinion, is used to control countries in terms of the policies that they put out. So a lot of the policies that we're seeing in recent years, but also just since independence and since the growth of this influence of international financial institutions has seen us go in a certain direction when it comes to taxation. So for the case of Africa, again, we did a study as ActionAid and partners last year, and this was basically assessing the African Union, 52 African Union countries, and we found that about 73% are in debt distress or at significant risk of debt distress. So just to put that into perspective, you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of spending and looking at the budgets, and just to illustrate the effect of the advice that we're getting, and also the position we're in terms of debt, you find that debt servicing costs alone, in the case of Zambia, we're accounting for much more, at a point almost double in 2022, double what we're spending on education, health, social protection, water and sanitation combined. And since then, I think some of you may be aware that Zambia was one of the first countries during COVID to default on their loans. So since then, we've been trying to restructure our debt. And again, this restructuring process has taken place based on the advice of the IMF. So there's the G20 Common Framework, which the IMF has been pushing for countries to use, particularly in the Global South, I think, but also some few other countries outside of Africa have also signed on to this common framework. But that's what has been used as a basis for the restructuring of our debt and the negotiating with the various creditors that we have. So during that process, we saw that we were not paying our debt service obligations for external debt, and that saw like a reduction in spending on our debt servicing. So as you can see, that purple line dips quite significantly over the 2 years that followed 2022. And then since then, now that we are coming out of this negotiating process and we're starting to service our debts again, we're seeing basically a reverse of the trend, where we're now getting to a point where we are a year or so after we successfully negotiated our debt under the common framework, and we're already spending more on debt servicing than we're spending on other key social sectors. So in our opinion, this is basically undermining human rights, because these budgets are not even adequate as they stand. We're still very much underfunded when it comes to the education sector, but similarly in health, we have challenges when it comes to financing and providing quality public services for all. You can go to the next slide, but I think I wanted to just touch on the spending floors that are prescribed by the IMF. And again, this is also problematic for us because, one, the spending floors are usually much lower than what we even spend on, or much lower than any benchmarks on spending when it comes to these social sectors. So for the year of 2025, the spending flow on social sectors was about 60 billion kwacha, and this is just a flat rate throughout the year. And you see that it's less than what the IMF is telling the government to spend on debt servicing, but also it's much less than what is needed for these sectors. So in essence, it does operate more like a spending ceiling rather than a floor, because as long as the government meets that condition, the IMF is happy, and we can access their financing. So next slide, please. So in terms of why Africa has taken the lead, I think in a nutshell, basically, the low-income countries, most of which are in Africa, are the most affected by this global financial architecture. Particularly when it comes to taxation, you see that our tax revenues are very low in terms of how much we're collecting. And a lot of this is due to the fact that the system is being abused, and there's a lot of exploitation in how companies and wealthy individuals operate in our fragmented system, but a system that's also been imposed on us by various financial institutions. So as you can see in the graph, low-income countries, and this is information from about 3 years ago, from a study that we did on just to compare tax revenues across the globe. You see that low-income countries and middle-income countries are only collecting about half of what the OECD countries are collecting in terms of a share of their GDP. So you find that our needs may be higher, and there's issues like poverty, inequality that just keep on increasing. But in terms of how much we can actually collect through our tax systems and our tax policies, a lot of these resources are lost, and usually to tax havens and to countries in the global north through various mechanisms, such as transfer pricing. We did quite a famous study as ActionAid about 10 years ago, looking at our biggest sugar company, which is British owned. Actually, the headquarters are in Ireland. It was called Sweet Nothings, and basically it used double taxation agreements between Zambia, Ireland, and Mauritius to channel and shift profits out of the country. And it was quite a significant case. I think since then, our ministries of finance have cancelled the agreements between Zambia and Mauritius. And I think the one with Ireland is under review, but I think with the influence that European countries have through mechanisms and through institutions like the OECD, it's still in effect. And this is an agreement that came into, well, not the Ireland agreement, but the France agreement, double taxation agreement between Zambia and France, is one that was actually coined and agreed upon before we even got our independence, and it's still active to this day, and is used to shift profits and avoid taxes by these multinational companies operating in Zambia. So double taxation is still a very big issue amongst many other much more technical issues with our current taxation system. Another reason why Africa is trying to, or is taking lead, I think, is issues around sovereignty and accountability. There's been a growing trend of governments being much more accountable towards these institutions such as the IMF, as opposed to the people and the citizens that voted them in or that put them there. So you find that there's question marks around sovereignty in terms of the policies that we create. Interactions with our technocrats within our revenue authorities and our ministries of finance usually reveal that a lot of their reasoning, a lot of their actions are based on models that are designed by the OECD, for instance. So even in terms of their training, in terms of interventions and changes that they can make, it's usually within these frameworks, and that's all they know. So I think in terms of us being sovereign and coming up with our own solutions, I think that's another reason why Africa is taking a lead in this. I've spoken to the debt challenges. For us, obviously, we feel that tax is the most reliable and predictable source of revenues for countries. But at the moment, we're still very heavily reliant on debt, and that's usually external debt from the global north and from international financial institutions that are largely controlled by the global north. And then, yeah, I think issues around economic justice as well. I think the UN Tax Convention also presents a much more inclusive solution for African nations who have taken a backseat in decision making and so on, while grappling with issues around poverty and inequality. So the next slide, please. So in terms of what we want, yeah, so in a nutshell, I think I mentioned in the previous slide, but I think why we want the UN Tax Convention is basically to level the playing field and ensure that each country has an equal right, equal representation, but also equal decision-making powers when it comes to how we formulate tax policy at a global level. Another thing we would want to see as an outcome or as a result of the UN Tax Convention would be to have sufficient social sector spending revenue. As I outlined, our social sectors are basically the drivers of change when it comes to equality, when it comes to upholding human rights, and we see this as a conduit for that, and as a facilitator of better social spending and much more equality when it comes to service delivery, which is also in its current state is also leaving the door open to the private sector, which basically doubles down on inequalities in various ways. And then the UN Tax Convention would also eliminate unfair debt traps that undermine human rights. I think I've mentioned that, or I illustrated how Zambia is essentially in a debt trap, given that we've basically just kicked the can down the road in terms of debt obligations, but we haven't really changed anything fundamentally in terms of how we're collecting revenues, in terms of how we're taxing multinationals and so on. So without that fundamental change, we just continue to face the same problems. If anything, worsen the current status quo. And then lastly, to have a much more uniform and just global policies and commitments to ensure equitable, fair, and legitimate flows of resources. Through the UN Tax Convention, again, would have an opportunity to rewrite some of the injustices of the past, but also ensure that they don't occur again moving forward. A lot of these institutions have got colonial tendencies in terms of the advice, but also in terms of the exploitative nature of these institutions and what they're advising our governments. Next, I think that should be the final slide. So I've just put in a few links to some of the information I shared, particularly how much Africa is losing, but also a link to the recent study we did on the 52 African Union countries. So I'll end there, Thomas. Thank you.
Ucizi, is it okay to take a couple of questions while we still have you with us? So what we're going to do is just, if anybody has any questions, just for Ucizi, and then we're going to take a break before we move on to Nessa. So in this section, it will just be questions or comments for Ucizi. Vicky?
So I know you, Vicky.
Okay, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Just earlier, Alex was saying that politicians will tend towards the interests of those with the most money and power, and that it's up to civil society to make them do otherwise. And so I'm wondering what accounted for that shift in the African leadership of the African Union. Was there a movement of civil society activism and demands that led us there, that led you there?
Do you want to take a couple of questions, Ucizi, or individual responses?
Yeah, I can take a few.
Let's take two. There's one more ready.
Yeah, it was just the question of foreign direct investment. You mentioned that there would be, it sounded like you were saying that tax agreements would follow foreign direct investment. So does that work in the sense that, you know, if the Irish government might support Irish companies to invest in Zambia, but as a result of that, or if that's to happen, they want favourable tax sort of agreements? Is that how that works? That's the question.
I might just add one other question, is that okay?
Okay, one more and then we'll go to you, Ucizi, for the responses.
Thanks so much, Ucizi. Just in terms of, it's kind of following on to that question around activism, in Zambia, like in Kenya earlier in this year, the resistance to IMF kind of and getting the Kenyan public engaged. In terms of the Zambian public and what work has been done, and is there pushes by the Zambian general public for the Zambian government to take a stronger line with the IMF, for instance, or where have you gotten to with that? Thanks.
Okay. So maybe I can take I can respond to those three questions. Maybe starting with the first one around the politics of the Africa group and what led to this UN tax convention. I think for us, speaking for Zambia, I think in terms of the actions of the Africa group, I think a lot of it was led by Nigeria, but also countries like Kenya, were I think a bit more vocal, a bit more independent when it comes to what they can push for as governments. But I think at the end of the day, it came to an overall country consensus through that UN vote. But there were countries that were very much on the fence, and I think this also answers the final question. Countries like Zambia are very much in line with the global or international financial institutions. So in terms of resisting the OECD, for instance, through supporting this UN tax convention, Zambia was one of the few countries actually that were on the fence. I think even at the first vote, we abstained from voting, but have since changed our decision or our position on the UN tax convention now that it's rolling and now that more African countries are on board. So you find that because of the advice, we're signed on to the inclusive framework under the OECD alongside a few other African countries. So I think because of that, our government may have felt hand-tied. I can't know for sure, but they may have felt that they can't support an alternative to the global financial architecture and to the global tax policy space. But I think since then we've seen a shift in our government's position, and I think a few other countries have shown that they are on board with the UN tax convention. But I think it was definitely led by a few stronger, much more independent countries. I think also South Africa was one of the leading countries in terms of the proposition, but also in terms of advocacy and so on. In terms of Kenya and Nigeria and what Zambia is doing as civil society, yeah, so we have been mobilizing around the UN tax convention at regional level, but also at national level to highlight in terms of the benefits of that. And I think a lot of that advocacy was actually directed towards our ministries of finance, but also our revenue authorities who base a lot of their work on these existing frameworks. So it was basically proposing an alternative to what has always been known. and that's work that we continue to do. We do find that there are differences in the avenues we take to address these issues with the government. You find that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance, is much more welcoming to ideas such as the UN Tax Convention. Our permanent mission to the UN, for instance, are much more accommodating. While ministries of finance, we do find that they're a bit more resistant because it means they have to forget what they've always known in terms of the advice that they get and work from there. So I think they're much more in a box, and I think we are trying to chip away at some of those issues, and we've got various alliances as civil society, and as ActionAid, we also work with the young people in terms of social movements, and we have what we call activista, who are basically the youth who are working on issues around economic justice, issues around tax, and we try to mobilize them and use certain platforms within our youth space as ActionAid here in Zambia. But there is quite a long way to go with the UN Tax Convention as Africa, but also as countries of the world, because you find that there's a lot of resistance from the global North countries. So you find that the original proposition that was made to the UN has since been, I can say, watered down in terms of asks and in terms of what is feasible and what can work. And this is mostly due to the resistance from, for instance, EU countries that are not really for going some of what they're benefiting from these tax setups and sharing taxing rights and so on. So I think there's still a long way to go, and I think working with civil society such as yourselves and more in these countries that are resisting change would be another way forward, or an alternative way forward, in addition to what the Africa Group is already doing. In terms of double taxation agreements, so I think these are basically treaties between countries, and they agree how to share taxing rights. Why they're problematic for countries like Zambia is that you find that, first of all, there are very few Zambian companies that would benefit from these treaties. We recently signed one, I think last year, with Turkey. But I think in terms of Zambian companies operating in Turkey, they're probably a handful. Meanwhile, we've seen a lot of investment, or Turkish investment, coming into Zambia, and you find that those are the companies that are benefiting from these double taxation agreements. In terms of governments pushing for their own companies to operate abroad, that's definitely happening. So it's a bit hard to prove, but I think in terms of the benefits, usually the taxing rights we are basically writing away our taxing rights through these agreements and giving them to countries in the global north. So I think from our 22 double taxation agreements, I think the majority of them are with European countries. So yes, I would say that there's a strong linkage between these agreements and our foreign direct investment, but also the strategy and the advice that we get from the IMF and the language you hear from our ministries of finance, our development units, and so on are to incentivize through removal of taxes, granting of tax holidays, and making it as favorable as possible for foreign companies to operate in Zambia, while foregoing a lot of our tax revenue. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Any final questions for Ucizi?
I have a question. Is there any way we could support the initiatives over there from here?
Did you hear that, Ucizi?
Yes, I did. Yeah, definitely. I think, like I mentioned, we did quite a significant study a few years ago around just how transfer pricing, for instance, works between particularly Zambia and Ireland. But I think in the conversation of the UN Tax Convention, I think, like I mentioned, I think it's in terms of assistance from institutions or organizations like yourself, the support would come from trying to understand the positions of your governments and what kind of work you can do in country as the global north to champion and push for this UN Tax Convention, so that it's not only the Africa group against the world, but we have many more countries on board. So I think convincing your respective governments to support this and to highlight, for instance, the issues of human rights and how we can link tax justice to human rights and how it's being undermined through these various treaties and through this current system. I think that would be the best way you would be able to help. But I think obviously sessions like today, where we learn from each other and we have discussions and are on the same page, I think are also very much helpful as a start. And then from there we can see what kind of activities, what kind of interventions can be made to champion for a UN Tax Convention. Yeah.
Great, I think that was a really great note to finish on. Thank you, Ucizi, for being with us, and we look forward to following up with you on these issues. So maybe just an applause again for that.